The rain came down in sheets that October evening, the kind of relentless, soul-soaking downpour that turns the world outside your window into a watercolor painting left out in a storm. My little cabin, tucked away by the lake, felt like the last dry spot on Earth. The rhythmic drumming on the tin roof was usually a comfort, a sound I'd come to associate with peace. But not tonight. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet pine and the clean, sharp smell of ozone from the storm. I was 52 years old, and this cabin, a relic I'd inherited from my grandfather, was pretty much all I had left. My career as a hydrologist, a fancy word for a guy who understands where water goes, had ended in a spectacular, reputation-shattering flameout a few years back. I made a call on a big project, a dam assessment. I was sure of my data, but I was wrong. The fallout cost investors millions and cost me everything else. So I retreated here, to the one place where the only thing I had to answer to was the rising of the sun. On the table in front of me, old survey maps were spread out like ancient scrolls, and sitting right in the middle of them, holding down a corner of a geological chart, was a small, scratched metal tube. It was my old fluorescent dye tracer, a symbol of my past life, the kind of tool you use to see what's invisible, to track the secret paths water takes deep beneath the ground. I hadn't touched it in years. That's when the door didn't knock. It exploded inward. A blast of wind and rain ripped through the cabin, scattering my papers. And through the doorway, a woman poured in. She was in her mid-40s, blonde, with a face that looked like it had been permanently set in a state of disapproval. She wore an expensive-looking trench coat that was already dripping a puddle onto my worn wooden floor. Behind her, two large, silent figures hovered in the doorway, like a pair of grim-faced gargoyles. This was Karen, the self-appointed queen of our newly formed homeowners association. She didn't apologize for the intrusion. She didn't even seem to notice the storm she'd let in. Her eyes scanned my small, tidy space with a look of undisguised contempt. "You have 30 days, she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain like a shard of glass. I just stared at her, completely stunned. 30 days for what? To get this shack, she said, flicking her wrist in a gesture of dismissal that was more insulting than any word she could have chosen. Off association property. She took a step forward, her heels clicking with an unnerving confidence on my floorboards. She was holding a folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to me. She threw it onto the table, right on top of my grandfather's maps. This is where the story really begins, and if you're watching Karenology, you already know. It's never just a simple misunderstanding. I picked up the paper. It was an official-looking letterhead from the Homeowners Association. My eyes jumped to the bolded text, a fine of $5,000 for unauthorized occupation of common land. And below that, in smaller print that felt 10 times more menacing, an additional $500 for every day the violation continued. My stomach turned to ice. "This is my land," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My family has owned this plot for 70 years. Karen let out a short, humorless laugh. "The survey says otherwise. The new one. The one that matters." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger out my window towards the opposite shore where a monstrous, brand-new clubhouse stood. It was a monument of glass and steel, glowing with an obnoxious amount of light against the darkening storm. "We're cleaning up the neighborhood, improving property values. Your little hovel is an eyesore and, as it turns out, an encroachment." Her two shadows took a step forward, and I felt the air in the small cabin shrink. Have you ever been cornered in your own home? It's a feeling that strips something away from you, something deep and fundamental. If you've ever felt that, you know what I was going through. Go ahead and hit that like button, because this was just the opening shot. "Get out," I said, my voice low and shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. Karen just smiled. It was a cold, predatory thing. "The clock is ticking, Mr. Evans. 30 days. Or my bulldozer gets to have some fun. We'll send you the bill for that, too." And with that, they were gone. They pulled the door shut behind them, leaving me in the sudden, deafening silence, broken only by the rain. I stood there for a long time, the letter clutched in my hand, the paper growing damp from my trembling fingers. I looked from the obscene number on the page to the little dye tube on my table. My whole life was spent looking for things hidden beneath the surface. It was a strange thought to have right then. I walked to the window and stared out across the churning, rain-pocked water at their glowing fortress. She called it an eviction notice. But looking at that monument to her greed, I knew what it really was. It was a declaration of war. I stood there for what felt like an hour, the damp letter from the Homeowners Association clutched in my hand. The ink was starting to blur. $5,000. That might as well have been $5 million. After my career imploded, my savings had dwindled to almost nothing. This cabin wasn't just my home. It was my last stand against total financial ruin. The rain on the roof no longer sounded like a lullaby. It sounded like a ticking clock. War, I'd thought. But wars aren't won with anger. They're won with strategy. I spent the next 2 days fueled by black coffee and a cold, simmering rage. I dug out every piece of paper my grandfather had ever filed. The original deed from the 1950s, property tax receipts going back decades, and the old, hand-drawn survey map with its faded ink and precise, elegant script. My case was ironclad. The land was mine. The law was on my side. Or so I thought. Karen had called an emergency community meeting. The email, dripping with passive aggression, said it was to discuss neighborhood standards and compliance issues. I knew what that meant. It was a public execution, and I was the guest of honor. The clubhouse was everything my cabin wasn't. It was all sharp angles, cold glass, and sterile white walls. The air smelled of new carpet and that cheap cloying coffee they serve at corporate events. Dozens of my neighbors were there, people I'd nodded to at the local store, folks I'd shared a quiet wave with on the lake. Tonight, their faces were a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I was the entertainment. I found a seat in the back, my folder of documents feeling like a flimsy shield. I saw George near the front. He was a retired surveyor, a man I'd shared a beer with a few times, talking about contour lines and boundary markers. He was old school, a man of integrity. I caught his eye and gave a small nod. He looked away, his face suddenly pale and tight. A cold knot formed in my gut. Karen took the stage, beaming like she was accepting an award. She spoke about community, shared values, and protecting our investment. It was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak. Then her eyes found me in the crowd. Which brings us to a pressing issue. A huge screen flickered to life behind her. It showed an aerial view of the lake, our properties outlined in neat, digital boxes. As most of you know, we had a new, state-of-the-art survey done before breaking ground on our beautiful new community center. She clicked a button. A red line appeared, slicing right through my cabin. Unfortunately, it has revealed a significant encroachment by Mr. Evans's property onto association common land. A murmur went through the crowd. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "That's not correct," I said, my voice louder than I intended. "I have the original deed and survey right here. This cabin has been on this exact spot for over 70 years. Karen gave me a look of pitying condescension. "Old documents can be inaccurate, Mr. Evans. We are legally bound by the most recent certified survey." It was so smooth, so practiced. She was using the letter of the law to strangle the spirit of it. But she wasn't done. Oh no. This wasn't just about land, this was about annihilation. "But the boundary," she said, her voice dropping, "is only part of the problem." She clicked her remote again. A new slide appeared, a list of bullet points. "We've received numerous complaints." She began to read. Complaint 1, an unpermitted aging septic system potentially leaking into our pristine lake. Complaint 2, improperly stored firewood, creating a fire hazard for the entire community. Complaint 3, the generally dilapidated state of the structure negatively impacting the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. The air was sucked out of the room. I could feel every eye on me. These weren't complaints. They were character assassinations. My septic system was new and fully permitted. The firewood was stacked exactly as the fire code prescribed. And my dilapidated cabin was old, yes, but it was lovingly maintained. Have you ever been lied about so publicly that the lie becomes the truth? That's what was happening. It was my word against hers, and she had a PowerPoint presentation. It's all lies," I stammered, but my voice was lost in the growing hum of disapproval from the crowd. People were whispering, shaking their heads. They weren't looking at a neighbor anymore. They were looking at a liability, a threat. I looked for George again, desperately seeking one friendly face, One person who knew this was wrong. He was staring intently at his shoes, his shoulders hunched. He knew. He knew what she was doing was a perversion of his own profession. And he did nothing. I sat down, my legs feeling like they couldn't hold me. I was no longer a person. I was a problem to be solved. In the local community group chat on my phone, a notification popped up. It was a post from an anonymous user. Can't believe we have people living like that here. Disgusting. It's dragging our property values through the mud. The first comment appeared a second later. I know, right? Get him out. Karen was still talking, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. All I could hear was the sound of a community turning on one of its own. I looked at the faces around me, the suspicion, the judgment. It was no longer a room full of neighbors. It was a firing squad, and they had all just been handed their rifles. I looked down at my useless folder of facts and truth, and I knew. This fight wouldn't be won here. It wouldn't be won with paper. The game was rigged, and I had just been made the villain in my own story. I walked out of that clubhouse into the cold night air, the forced smiles and suspicious glances of my neighbors burning into my back. The public humiliation was a bitter pill to swallow. Karen hadn't just drawn a line on a map. She had drawn a line through the community, and I was on the wrong side of it. Back in the solitude of my cabin, the sense of defeat was overwhelming. It felt like my failed career all over again. A mountain of facts on my side, but I was still the one getting buried. For the next few nights, sleep was a stranger. I'd sit at my grandfather's table, staring at the maps, the old ones and Karen's new fraudulent one. I kept thinking, what am I missing? A legal fight was a non-starter. I couldn't afford a lawyer to take on an entire homeowners association. And even if I could, they had the most recent survey. The system was designed to protect people like Karen. But my past life, the one that had ended in disgrace, had taught me one thing. The surface story is never the whole story, especially when it comes to the earth. Land isn't just a flat plane on a surveyor's map. It's a living, breathing thing with secrets buried deep inside. So, I stopped looking at the boundary lines. I started looking at what was underneath. I pulled out my old geological charts, the ones I'd spent my life studying. They were detailed cross-sections of the region's substrate. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a glaring error. It was an anomaly. A subtle note in the corner of a 50-year-old survey, something a modern corner-cutting surveyor would easily ignore. It was a mention of karst topography. Now, that might sound like technical jargon, but let me break it down for you. Imagine the ground beneath your feet isn't solid rock. Imagine it's more like Swiss cheese, a network of hidden caves, channels, and voids carved out by water over thousands of years. That's a karst system. It's an underground plumbing network created by nature. And according to this old chart, a significant network of these channels ran directly under my property. And, more importantly, directly under where Karen had built her shiny new clubhouse. Suddenly, the pieces started clicking into place. I remembered something I'd overheard during the clubhouse construction a year ago, chatter about them hitting soft spots and having to bring in extra fill. They hadn't hit soft spots. They'd hit the top of a geological hornet's nest. This changed everything. My problem wasn't a 5-foot property line dispute anymore. The real issue wasn't where my cabin was. It was where her clubhouse was. Building a heavy structure, complete with extensive plumbing and a septic field, on top of a karst system, that's not just bad engineering. That's an environmental time bomb. Whatever they flushed down their drains wouldn't just sit in a leach field. It would enter a hidden underground highway, and there was no telling where it would come out. But how could I prove it? It was a theory based on a 50-year-old map. I needed something more. I needed help. There was only one person I could think of who might have access to the kind of detailed archival records I needed, the county archivist. The next morning, I drove into town. The archives were in the basement of the old county courthouse, a place that smelled of dust and decaying paper. Behind the counter was a young woman with bright, intelligent eyes. Madison. She couldn't have been more than 22. I explained what I was looking for, trying not to sound like a crazy person obsessed with underground tunnels. I just said I was researching the historical geology of the lakefront. She listened patiently, a small, curious smile on her face. "That's an unusual request," she said. "Most people just want old birth certificates." She led me back into the stacks. The shelves were packed floor to ceiling with heavy leather-bound ledgers and boxes of rolled-up documents. If it exists, it's in here, she said, leaving me to my treasure hunt. Hours went by. I felt a familiar thrill, the one I hadn't felt since my career went down in flames. The thrill of the hunt, of piecing together a puzzle no one else could see. And then, in a dusty box labeled Lakefront Development Surveys 1960-1975, I found it. It wasn't a single document, but a series of them. Test boring reports from an old, failed development plan from the 70s. The developer had abandoned the project. The reason was stated in a stark final memo: unstable and unpredictable subterranean water flow due to extensive karst formations. It was the smoking gun. They knew. The county knew, at least at one point, that building on that land was a terrible idea. Karen and her cut-rate contractor had either deliberately ignored it or, more likely, never bothered to do the real research. I had the proof, but paper can be argued with, as I'd already learned. Paper can be dismissed as outdated. I needed something more. I needed something visceral, something they couldn't ignore. I needed to make the invisible visible. As I drove home, the plan began to form in my mind. It was risky. It was probably illegal, but it was the only shot I had. I looked at the passenger seat where the box of documents lay. Next to it, in my tool bag, was that old scratched tube of fluorescent dye. My symbol anchor. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Karen wanted to fight about what was on the surface. Fine. I was about to show her, and everyone else, exactly what was going on underneath. The plan was simple, and that's what made it so dangerous. I was going to prove my theory with a little demonstration. My weapon of choice? That small tube of rhodamine B dye. It's a harmless but intensely colored fluorescent tracer. A few ounces of this stuff in a water system can be detected miles away. I was betting that if I introduced it into the clubhouse's drainage, it wouldn't stay put. It would journey through those hidden karst channels and reappear somewhere else entirely, somewhere public. So, under the cloak of a moonless night, I became a saboteur. Creeping through the woods that separated my property from the clubhouse felt like something out of a spy movie. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the snap of twigs under my boots and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. It had been a long time since I had taken a risk this big. The clubhouse was dark and silent, a sleeping giant. I found the main drainage cleanout behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges. It was almost too easy. With trembling hands, I unscrewed the cap. The faint, unpleasant smell of waste drifted up. Taking a deep breath, I emptied the entire contents of the dye tube into the pipe. The bright pink liquid vanished into the darkness with a quiet gurgle. I screwed the cap back on, wiped my prints, and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by my window, staring at the lake, waiting for the sunrise. I expected to see a telltale plume of bright green. The dye turns green in certain pH conditions, spreading from the shoreline near the clubhouse. It would be undeniable, a toxic bloom originating directly from their pristine new building. But as the sun climbed higher, the lake remained stubbornly blue. Nothing. No green stain, no plume. Just the calm, clear water of an autumn morning. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Had I been wrong? Was the karst theory just a desperate fantasy? My answer came 2 days later, not in the form of an ecological disaster, but in the form of another email from Karen. She was calling a second urgent meeting. The subject line was a single word: vandalism. The atmosphere in the clubhouse this time was not just suspicious, it was hostile. Karen stood at the front, her face a mask of righteous fury. "As you all know," she began, "we have been dealing with a compliance issue regarding Mr. Evans." She let my name hang in the air like a dirty word. "It seems Mr. Evans has escalated his campaign against our community." She then introduced a man in a crisp white shirt as a certified environmental consultant. The man, whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes, proceeded to give a short presentation. He had taken water samples from the lake all around the clubhouse. He held up a vial of crystal clear water. "The lake is perfectly clean," he declared. "There is absolutely no evidence of any contamination." Then Karen dropped the bombshell. "However," she said, her voice dripping with fake solemnity, "our maintenance staff did find evidence of tampering with our drainage system, and a security camera on the back of the building caught this." The screen behind her flickered, and my blood ran cold. It was grainy black and white footage, but it was unmistakably me, crouched by the cleanout pipe, emptying the dye. The crowd gasped. It was the perfect trap. I had walked right into it. "This man," Karen thundered, pointing at me, in a desperate and pathetic attempt to frame this association, tried to stage an act of what can only be described as ecological terrorism. The room erupted. People were yelling, pointing. I was a pariah. My daily fine, I later learned, had now climbed to $12,500, not including the new fines for willful destruction of property. Have you ever been so thoroughly outmaneuvered that you can't even see a way out? You feel your world shrinking to the size of a jail cell. Defeated, I left the meeting without a word. There was only one person left I could turn to, one last hope. George, the old surveyor. He had to know the truth about that land. He had to have seen the same old maps I had. I found him in his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and old paper. He looked up when I came in, his face etched with guilt. I didn't waste time. I laid it all out. The karst system, the old reports, Karen's frame-up. I begged him. "Just tell them what you know, George. Your word would mean everything." He wouldn't meet my eye. He just kept sanding a piece of wood, his knuckles white. "I can't, Liam," he mumbled. "Can't or won't." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, weary shame. "She knows, Liam. Karen, she knows about the old Henderson survey. From 20 years ago." My heart sank. The Henderson survey was a legendary screw-up in local history, a mistake in a boundary line that cost the county a fortune to fix. "I was the junior surveyor on that job," George whispered. "It wasn't my fault, but my name is on the paperwork. If I cross her, she'll bring it all up. I'll lose my license, my pension, everything." He looked at me, a broken old man. "I'm sorry, son. She's got me. My advice? Just give up. Sell the land. Get out while you still can." I walked out of his workshop and into the fading afternoon light. The last door had just slammed shut in my face. I was completely, utterly alone. The world was convinced I was a villain. My only potential ally had been neutralized, and I was staring down a mountain of debt I could never repay. Karen hadn't just won. She had buried me. The days that followed were the darkest I'd known. I was a ghost in my own community. When I went to the local store for groceries, conversations would stop. People would turn their backs. The friendly cashier who used to ask about my day now avoided my eyes and pushed my change across the counter in silence. I wasn't just an outcast, I was a contagion. My phone was a constant source of anxiety. Emails from the Homeowners Association, each one adding another layer of fines and legal threats. Notifications from the community forum, where my name was now synonymous with troublemaker and psycho. It's a strange thing, digital shunning. The silence is louder than any insult. I spent most of my time inside the cabin, the walls feeling like they were closing in. I was defeated. George's betrayal, though I understood it, had cut deeper than Karen's open hostility. He was a man of principles, and she had found the price to make him abandon them. It made me wonder about my own principles. What was the point of being right if the world had already decided you were wrong? One evening, I was just sitting there, staring into a cold cup of coffee, when the thought first crossed my mind. Maybe George was right. Maybe I should just give up, sell the cabin, pay the fines, and disappear. What was I even fighting for? A pile of wood and a patch of dirt that everyone else seemed to think wasn't mine anyway. I was deep in that spiral of despair when I decided to go for a drink. I needed to be around people, even if they hated me. I needed a change of scenery from the four walls of my self-imposed prison. The local tavern was quiet. Bob, the owner, a gruff man in his 50s with a face like a road map, was polishing glasses behind the bar. He saw me walk in, and for a second, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. I expected him to ask me to leave. Instead, he just nodded. "Liam," he grunted. "Rough week, huh?" "You could say that," I said, slumping onto a stool at the far end of the bar. He poured me a bourbon without asking. "On the house," he said. "You look like you need it." We sat in silence for a while. The only other patrons were a young couple in a booth, lost in their own world. Then the door opened, and my heart sank. It was one of Karen's guys, the technician, the one who was always hovering in the background like a cheap thug. He was with a woman, and they sat at a table not far from me. I tried to ignore them. I focused on the amber liquid in my glass, the sharp burn of the whiskey. But I couldn't help but overhear them. The technician was trying to impress his date, his voice loud and boastful. And that's when he said it. "Yeah, this whole thing with the old guy, Evans," he said with a snort. "It's hilarious. Karen's got him running in circles." His date giggled. "She had me install this fancy new drainage system for the clubhouse, top of the line. But," he lowered his voice, "but not enough. She didn't want to pay to run the pipe all the way to the main sewer line. Said it was too expensive. So, you know what I did?" He leaned in conspiratorially. "There's an old abandoned well behind the clubhouse. Been there for 100 years. I just rerouted the whole system to drain into that. Saved her 20 grand. She thinks I'm a genius. She doesn't even know. Everything just disappears." He laughed. His date laughed. But I didn't laugh. I sat there, frozen, the bourbon glass halfway to my lips. Every hair on my arm stood on end. My mind was racing, connecting the dots with the speed of a lightning strike. It disappears. The dye. It didn't go into the lake. It went down, deep down, into the old well. And what was the well connected to? A 100-year-old shaft drilled straight into the heart of the earth, straight into the karst network. I threw a 20 on the bar, my hands shaking. "Thanks, Bob," I said, my voice hoarse. Bob looked at me, then glanced over at the technician, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low and raspy, "you don't win by arguing, Liam. You win by showing them what they don't want to see." I ran out of that bar. I didn't drive. I ran. Through the woods, stumbling in the dark, my lungs burning. The old well, I knew exactly where it was. My grandfather had shown it to me when I was a kid. A crumbling stone circle half swallowed by weeds and time. I found it, just a few hundred yards behind the clubhouse. The smell hit me first. A foul odor of rot and stagnant water. I fumbled for the flashlight on my phone. I pointed the beam down into the dark opening. The well was deep. The beam barely reached the bottom, but then I saw it. At the very edge of the light, clinging to the damp stone walls just above the murky water, was a faint but unmistakable residue. A ghostly, ethereal green glow. It was my dye. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting for me to find it. I looked up from the glowing well towards the dark silhouette of the clubhouse. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The game wasn't over. I had just found a new board to play on, and this time, I was the one who knew the rules. I had the proof, not on paper, not in a grainy video, but glowing at the bottom of a forgotten well. It was real physical evidence that Karen's entire operation was a sham built on a foundation of lies and cheap shortcuts. But what good was it if I was the only one who saw it? Shoving a flashlight down a well in the middle of the night wasn't going to convince anyone. I needed a stage. I needed an audience. I needed to turn their own game against them. And then I remembered the annual Fall Festival. It was the biggest community event of the year, held on the great lawn that sloped down to the lake. It was Karen's pet project, a showcase for her vision of a perfect upscale community. Hundreds of people would be there. It was the perfect stage. My first call was to Madison, the young archivist. I met her for coffee, far away from the prying eyes of the lake community. I laid out everything, the karst system, the dye, the secret drain pipe, the glowing well. I showed her the photos on my phone. Her eyes went wide. "They're poisoning the groundwater," she whispered, horrified. "And no one knows it," I said. "But they will. I have a plan, but I need your help. I need something from the archives, but this time, it's not a map." I explained what I needed. It was a long shot, a piece of equipment the county might not have even owned anymore. "I think I know where to find one," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "Consider it done." My next step was more delicate. I needed to set the scene, and for that, I had to do the one thing I'd been avoiding. I had to talk to one of my neighbors. Not just any neighbor. I needed someone with a very specific skill set. I went to the one person who had shown me a sliver of decency. The one who'd told me what the technician had said. Bob, the bartender. It turned out he knew a guy, a stagehand who did lighting for local theater productions and owed Bob a favor, a very big favor. The day of the fall festival was bright and crisp, a perfect autumn afternoon. The great lawn was buzzing with activity. Families on blankets, kids running around, the smell of popcorn and grilled hot dogs in the air. It was a picture of idyllic community life, a picture painted by Karen. She was in her element, gliding through the crowd, accepting compliments, her smile as wide and artificial as the clubhouse behind her. She took the stage at dusk, just as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the lake. She stood at a podium, ready to deliver her triumphant speech about the success and prosperity of their little lakeside paradise. That was my cue. I walked toward the stage. A few people noticed me and started whispering. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I could feel the hostility, the collective memory of my public shaming. Karen saw me approaching, and her smile tightened into a thin, angry line. One of her security guys moved to intercept me. "Let him speak," a voice boomed from the side of the stage. It was Bob. He was standing by the sound system, his arms crossed. He gave me a subtle nod. The security guard hesitated, confused. I didn't go to the stage. I walked past it, down toward the edge of the lake, a microphone in my hand that Bob's friend had discreetly passed to me. The crowd turned, following me with their eyes, a sea of confused faces. "Sorry to interrupt," I said into the microphone, my voice echoing across the lawn. But Karen forgot to mention one of the most spectacular features of our new community. I looked back. On a small bluff overlooking the lake, Madison was standing next to a large, strange-looking device on a tripod. It was an old, high-powered, long-wave ultraviolet floodlight, the kind geologists use for mineral prospecting. The stagehand had helped her wire it into the festival's power grid. "Madison, if you would," I called out. She flipped a switch. A powerful, invisible beam of UV light shot out from the device, hitting a specific, seemingly random patch of shoreline about 100 yards away from the clubhouse. For a second, nothing happened. The crowd was silent, confused. I heard someone laugh. Karen was whispering furiously to her security guard. And then it began. Slowly, magically, the ground itself started to glow. A ghostly, luminous green light began to seep up from the soil right at the water's edge. It started as a faint patch, then grew brighter and wider, an unholy supernatural stain spreading across the shoreline, its eerie light reflected in the darkening water of the lake. The crowd gasped, a collective audible shock. The laughter died. The whispering stopped. Every single person was staring, mesmerized and horrified, at the glowing patch of earth. "What you're seeing," I said, my voice calm and steady, "is a harmless tracer dye, the same dye I poured into the clubhouse drain a week ago. I let that sink in. The one their expert said disappeared. Well, he was right. It did disappear, down an illegal drain, into an abandoned well, and straight into the underground water channels that run right under our feet. It's been traveling slowly for a week, and it just found its way out." I turned to face the crowd. Their faces were no longer hostile. They were pale with shock and dawning comprehension. "This is my dye," I said, holding up the empty tube for them all to see. "Imagine it's not dye. Imagine it's sewage. Imagine it's cleaning chemicals. Imagine it's everything that gets flushed down the drain of that clubhouse. This isn't just happening here. It's seeping into the groundwater we all drink, into the lake our children swim in." I looked directly at Karen, who was standing on the stage, frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her perfect festival, her moment of triumph, had turned into a live demonstration of her own toxic negligence. "You wanted my land, Karen," I said, my voice dropping but carrying across the silent lawn with perfect clarity. "But you forgot to check what was underneath." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The eerie green glow from the shoreline painted the shocked faces of the crowd. No one was looking at me as the villain anymore. All eyes were on Karen, standing alone on her stage, bathed in the sickly light of her own deceit. The glowing earth was a giant, luminous arrow pointing straight at her. The aftermath was chaos, not the loud, angry kind, but a quiet, seismic shift. The festival dissolved as people, murmuring in hushed, anxious tones, packed up their blankets and led their children away from the glowing shore. The party was over. Within a week, the Homeowners Association was in full-blown meltdown. The news of the contaminated groundwater spread like wildfire. The certified environmental consultant who had declared the lake clean vanished. The county health department descended, plastering notices all over the clubhouse, officially declaring it a public health hazard. The phones at the HOA office rang off the hook with angry, terrified homeowners. But the real blow came from the developer. the one who had been planning to buy up a huge tract of land from the association, a deal that was the cornerstone of Karen's financial ambitions. He was a ruthless businessman, but he wasn't stupid. The moment he heard groundwater contamination and unstable karst foundation, he pulled out. The multi-million-dollar deal evaporated overnight. That's when he came to me. He showed up at my cabin one evening, unannounced. He was a man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in my rustic home. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're a smart man, Mr. Evans," he said, looking around my small living room. "You cost me a lot of money, but you also saved me from a potential nightmare." He then made me an offer, a breathtaking one. He wanted to buy my land and my silence. He offered me triple its market value, cash. All I had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement, pack my bags, and walk away. He would deal with the contamination issue quietly, his way, and then salvage what he could of his development plans. Have you ever been handed a golden ticket out of all your problems? A simple, easy solution that erases all your debts and lets you start over? That's what this was. I could be gone in a week. New life, no more fights, no more neighbors who hated me. The money was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I thought about it. I really did. I thought about the peace, the quiet, the freedom from this whole mess. Then I looked out my window at the lake my grandfather had taught me to fish in. I thought about the families who lived here, the kids who swam in that water, all of them oblivious to the poison spreading beneath their feet until I had shined a light on it. "No," I said. My voice was quiet but firm. The developer looked at me, genuinely surprised. "No? Are you insane?" "Probably," I admitted. "But this is my home, and these are my neighbors, whether they like me or not. You can't just pave over a problem like this. It needs to be fixed, the right way." He stared at me for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "You really are something else, Evans." He stood up, shook my hand, and left. I didn't take the money. Instead, I did something crazier. I went to the next HOA meeting. The room was packed, but the mood was different. The anger was still there, but it was now directed at Karen, who sat at the front table looking small and defeated. I didn't run for a position on the board. I had no desire to be in charge. Instead, I made a proposal. I proposed that they scrap their entire leadership and elect a new board of actual homeowners, not real estate sharks. I proposed that they use their funds, now that they weren't buying a new fountain for the clubhouse entrance, to hire an independent geological firm, one of my choosing, to conduct a full transparent assessment of the entire area. And I proposed that they hire me, on a consulting basis, to oversee the project. It was a landslide. The old board was voted out. A new one was voted in. My proposal was accepted unanimously. Karen was stripped of all authority, her reign of terror over. She's now facing a mountain of lawsuits from the homeowners and the county. Her legacy isn't a shiny clubhouse. It's a glowing patch of toxic land. So, I won. I gotta keep my cabin. The land is safe. But it's not a simple happy ending. The price of my victory is the very thing I came here seeking. Solitude. My quiet life is over. My neighbors don't shun me anymore, but now they see me as some kind of reluctant hero, a watchdog. They stop by with questions about their soil, their wells, their property lines. I've become the unofficial guardian of the community. I saved my home, but in doing so, I had to open it up to the world. The other day, I was standing on my porch, looking out at the lake. The water was calm and clear again. The health department had begun the cleanup. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers brushed against that old scratch dye tube. I'd kept it as a reminder, a symbol of my old life, and now the tool of my unlikely resurrection. I took it out, looked at it one last time, and then I tossed it into the trash can. I didn't need it anymore. I had found my place, not by hiding from the world, but by holding it accountable. And that, I realized, was a victory far more valuable than any patch of land. It was a reclaiming of myself. And if you've ever had to fight for who you are, maybe you'll drop a comment and let me know, because those are the fights worth winning.